on today's edition of Virginia Conversations, an hour with U.S. Senator and former Governor Mark Warner. I'm Ailey Lee. Thanks for joining us today. Mark Warner was elected to the Senate in 2008 and currently serves on the Chamber's Banking, Budget, Commerce, and Intelligence Committees. He led the new Gang of Six in 2011 to end partisan gridlock in Congress and continues his work to reach a balanced solution to the federal budget and deficit crises. Warner was governor of Virginia from 2002 through 2006. During his tenure, the state was recognized as the nation's best managed state and the best state for business. We welcome from the U.S. Senate studios in Washington, Virginia's senior senator, Mark Warner. Good morning.
Good morning, Ailey. Nice to be with you.
It's great to be with you, too. And you can join our conversation by calling our toll-free number, 866-611-NEWS. That's 866-611-6397 if you have any questions or comments for the senator. You know, your political life began when you were a kid. You were president for 3 years at your high school in Connecticut. So is it safe to say that public service is in your blood?
Well, I've always had an interest in it. I mean, I kind of feel like I was growing up somewhat in the 60s, that I was old enough to be touched by the idealism of the 60s, but I was still young enough at that point that I didn't get cynical by the 70s. I did take some time out from public service or thinking about this for about 15 years where I was in business, and that taught me a lot. I failed a couple of times. First couple of times I went into business, and then the third time was a charm. I got into the cell phone industry and started the company. It was Nextel, and then became a venture capitalist. But I have felt that there's a lot of good in public service, and it's one of the things that worries me right now as we see what I think are a lot of good folks in both political parties walk away from this effort. And one of the reasons why I'm so focused, some people would say a little obsessed about things like this debt and deficit issue, not only because of the economic ramifications, but I think it's terribly important that we show the people of Virginia, the people of America, that our democratic institutions can still function in the 21st century. And the only way we can function if we can actually find common ground.
And that sort of ties into the Gang of Six. But before we get into the good stuff, you started back then in high school a tradition of weekly pickup basketball game at your house. Apparently, that continued on.
Well, it did. I actually have to tell you that back when I was governor and we had to find some ability to I was a Democratic governor with a legislature that was 2-1 Republican. But a number of the relationships I made with some of the legislators was the playing basketball. And one particular legislator, Chris Jones, I remember when we were trying to get out of the budget challenges Virginia had, it was having a beer after a basketball game that we started the beginnings of what ultimately led to a fairly major reform of the Virginia tax code back in 2004.
Who says that it has to be over golf?
Right. I'm not sure. I appreciate so many of the national folks who play golf, and I have great respect, of course, for everybody who plays golf, but I sure as heck don't have the patience for 4 hours with not that much exercise.
Well, you've got the height. You might as well work it.
Well, I've got the height, but I definitely fall into, I don't want to say any kind of stereotype, but, we'll leave the listeners to understand that I don't jump very well and I'm not very fast, but I do have sharp elbows and a big butt.
So here we are with no ability to segue out of that in a $16.5 trillion deficit. And we saw that sequestration was the response to that debt. And you were opposed to sequestration, to put it mildly. Explain.
Well, let's remember again, I know there's going to be some numbers here, but the numbers really do matter. How we got ourselves in such a big mess, and we are at $16.5 trillion in debt. It goes up $4 billion a day, and both parties bear blame, was that in the last 13 years, we cut taxes by $4.5 trillion. At the same time, on the spending side, we doubled defense spending, created Homeland Security, went to war twice on the credit card, created a new entitlement program called Medicare Part D to give our seniors free drug benefits. And then we thank goodness, we're all living a lot longer. But living a lot longer means that some of the math around Social Security and Medicare doesn't work anymore. So we have this problem. Everybody says we don't have to fix it.
And I'd like you to point
Go ahead.
I'd like to point this one out. Trivia question for everybody. Who created the age of retirement? Who
Well,
decided that? I know you know the answer
I
to
know
this question.
Thank you for that setup, because I ask every group who set 65 as the retirement age, and many people will say, well, it must have been Franklin Roosevelt. It actually wasn't. It was Bismarck when he was head of Germany in 1872, and he said, we, the government, will give you a check once you hit 65. But he said that because average life expectancy at that point was 57. Kind of a perfect politician promise. If you outlive the actuarial tables, we'll give you a check. Now we live in a country where we're blessed that we live to 80. Matter of fact, if you're a healthy woman today in America, age 20, chances are you're going to live to 100. And it means that the amount of people kind of working, paying in versus the number of people taking out of the system on both Medicare and Social Security has gotten out of balance. When I was a kid, there were 16 people working for every one person on retirement. Today, there are only 3 people working for every one person on retirement. In 15 years, it'll be down to 2 to 1. I believe strongly in Medicare and Social Security, but we have to make some changes to get the math right. So the problem that we came up with was that we don't have to fix this overnight. But we do have to knock about $4 trillion off of the debt over a 10-year basis. Everything in Washington is talked about on a 10-year time horizon. The good news, I guess, is that through all of this ugliness, we have done about $2 trillion worth of deficit reduction with the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling. Then one of the things we said was if we don't finish, what we will do is we will set up a default option that's so stupid that no rational group of people will allow it to happen. And that so stupid option was sequestration, which basically says, every part of government, whether it's a good part or bad part, are going to get cut equally. And we're not going to allow any exemptions. We're not going to look at what's working or not. And that's what we're doing right now. And we saw a lot of the public get upset when it looked like everybody was going to get delayed on their airplane flights. And that did get fixed. But the insidious part of this is that, we've gotten rid of Head Start for 70,000 kids. We've had hundreds of thousands of students not be able to get grants on Pell Grants and others. But we're also, what I think the public would be furious if they realize under the name of quote unquote cutting government, we're actually costing taxpayers more money. Let me give you 2 quick examples. One is when the government goes out and buys, just like if a family goes out and bulk purchases at Walmart, they did get a discount. Well, if we buy 10 tanks and we have a contract, if we will be breaking those contracts because we can't honor our commitments, and we will have to pay penalty fees, and the price of a tank will go up individually. Or more particularly, again, for an area that gets me so upset, on research grants. The National Institute of Health does some remarkable work. I had the head talk to me the other day where there was a 5-year cancer study being done. The first 4 years of the study had been done. Now, because of sequestration, they didn't have the money to go ahead and issue the 5th year of the grant. So that means the first 4 years of research basically gets flushed down the toilet. So this is, a ridiculous way to deal with this, something we need to alleviate. And we in Virginia are seeing, we've got a lot of federal employees, civilian and otherwise. Well, we've seen the furloughs go from 22 days down to 11 days. That still is 11 days without pay for a lot of our workforce. And, it's just not smart. And one last point, I know I'm going on long here, but this is important. I was a business guy, as been mentioned before. I was in government, and I've invested in a lot of business. And you always look at any business you invest in, and what does their workforce look like? How are they going to make whatever they make, and how are they going to stay ahead of the competition? Governments do the same thing. We simply call it education, infrastructure, and R&D. Well, the current approach we're on, and the approach that the House budget has, would take what is in federal government speak domestic discretionary spending, which is all the money we spend on early childhood and energy, but also education, infrastructure, research, and development, which is only right now 16 cents on every tax dollar that we spend. And it would over about 10 or 11 years would take that 16 cents down to about 4 cents. Well, I got to tell you, May Lily, as a business guy, not as a politician, but as a business guy, I would never invest in any business that spent less than 5% of its revenues on educating and training its workforce, on building its infrastructure, and staying ahead of the competition, which is basically what we're trying to do with research and development. So that's just a bad business plan for America. Again, one more reason why we've got to get this bargain, to get this this debt and deficit, and more importantly, our country's balance sheet right.
The number is 866-611-NEWS. That's 866-611-6397. Talking with Senator Mark Warner. When you were governor, Virginia had an unsustainable budget deficit, and you turned it around, while also making the largest investment in public education and higher education in Virginia history. So you were bringing those business principles to your role as governor. And now, as a senator, your message to your constituents are, we can't cut and tax our way out of this problem. We also need a growth agenda as well.
Absolutely. And that means we've got to get our taxes right, and we've got to get our spending under control, but we also have to have a plan on how we're going to grow jobs. And again, one of the things that I think probably a lot of Virginians are feeling is they see the stock market at record highs, but they don't feel wealthier themselves. Part of that is because corporate America is doing quite well, but they are unsure about where to invest those profits, so they're sitting on the sidelines. The remarkable thing is America looks pretty darn good compared to the rest of the world. Europe's got worse problems than us. Our financial system is recovered. We've got challenges in education, but still the best and the brightest in the world want to come to our colleges and universities. We continue to be the place where entrepreneurship is the most flourishing. So if we actually got this budget deal behind us, I think that will give confidence for some of this corporate profits sitting on the sideline to reinvest in America. That would be one point. Second point is we need to continue to find ways to promote startups, entrepreneurial companies. 80% of all the new jobs created in the last 20 years in America haven't come from really the big Fortune 500, and they haven't come from even the mom and pop grocery store or barber shop. They've come from startup ventures. So one of the things I've been passionate about is how do you encourage that entrepreneur to take a chance. In Northern Virginia, we've got a pretty healthy culture of that. In Southside and Southwest and in the Valley, it's not as robust. So legislation that was passed that most folks have not ever heard of, but it actually could be pretty powerful, is something called the Jobs Act, which allows people to raise money over the internet for new startup companies. Think about before there was eBay, this would be an eBay for new companies, where if you've got a new business venture in Martinsville and you've kind of gone to your friends and family, but you want to say, hey, are there others that want to invest in this? This would be a new tool that could be used. I think that could be very helpful for rural Virginia in terms of attracting capital. That's something else that's important. Third thing we need to do is, and this is why the research and development I think is so important in our universities, is, end of the day, America's value add to the overall world economy is going to be our intellectual capital. And that's why we have to continue to promote the research and development at our universities and elsewhere. And finally, one thing that I would, and a lot of people don't necessarily put this in this category, but I strongly do, we need this immigration reform to get done, because if you look at the value add, if I look just at the technology companies, for example, in Northern Virginia, about a third of them have one of their founders as a first-generation American. So if you're over here, I wish there were more American-born students getting a PhD in engineering at Virginia Tech, but if some of those foreign-born students are here getting a PhD at Virginia Tech in engineering, and they've got a job offer here or want to start a business here, we ought to allow that to happen, because here's the craziness of what's happened now. Other countries have seen how broken our immigration system is, so they've changed their laws. Canada, Australia, Britain. And so what we have now is we train a lot of the world's best and brightest at American universities. And then the Microsofts, the Googles, and the others say, well, if you can't stay in America, we're going to offer you a job in Canada. And with those high-paying, high-tech jobs come a lot of ancillary support jobs, and we are basically funding the economic development of some of our competitor nations.
We made reference to your passion for bipartisan solutions. And the Gang of Six refers to a group of 6 senators, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, all of whom believe that bipartisan cooperation is the key to breaking deadlock. So the original Gang of 6 was active in 2009 and focused on health care reform. Then you led a new Gang of Six in 2011 during the debt ceiling crisis. And in the fall of 2012, a new Gang of Six, or Gang of Eight, as they are called, came on the scene, and this time to craft a deficit reduction deal. But the Gang of Eight couldn't avoid sequestration. Why do you think the gangs are having trouble breaking through, though principally it seems like a great idea?
Well, Mary Lou, we actually, I do think it's kind of funny. One thing, Washington, D.C. may be the only place where being a gang member is a good thing. But our group was, while we were 6 or 8, depending on how you want to call it, we actually had 46 senators who were kind of signed on to our principles. They just, you couldn't get 46 folks in the room to negotiate a deal. We got 95% of the way there. And frankly, the forces of the status quo in both political parties, I'm not sure wanted a deal. Because end of the day, what we have to deal with, if we're not going to keep cutting education, if we're not going to overly cut defense, we have to realize our Republicans have to be willing to raise some more revenues, and the Democrats have to be willing to make some changes in the entitlement programs. And that goes against a lot of the kind of entrenched, established interest, particularly in Washington. When I came here as a senator, I was not naive, but I've been amazed at how much of this town tries to reinforce breaking you into the red shirt team and the blue shirt team, as opposed to saying, all right, what are we going to do for the country? It's more like, how do we make the other guys look bad? And that just seems crazy to me. I was a business guy. I would never look at my workforce and say, I'm going to take ideas from half the workforce, but not from the other half of the workforce. It's a crazy way to run an operation. So what these gang efforts, and I've been disappointed that we've not been more successful. I think we had a good plan. Our plan was based on the so-called Simpson-Bowles plan, which still I think was a good framework. But we're still at it. We've got one more shot, I think, before the end of the year. But what I've also been doing, because this new immigration group, the so-called Gang of Eight, and I think I'm very supportive of that. Not in the room, but have been very supportive, adding ideas, particularly on the high-tech, high-value worker end. But I started with another Republican senator, a fellow named Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, a series of dinners where we just get 20 senators together, Democrat and Republican, and have dinner and just talk about whatever, because there's a lot of efforts actually to try to keep us separate. And
and is there a pickup basketball game after that?
Well, we haven't. I haven't. The senator's a little bit older than the folks. We might need a respirator on the side if we played pickup basketball in the Senate. But
tell you what we're going to do.
I tell you what we do.
And
a glass of wine does sometimes help to get those conversations flowing.
And we're going to take a break here, and we will be right back with the senator after this break. Next week, a look at the race for governor. Stay with us. We're back in a minute. Welcome back to Virginia Conversations. Today we're talking with Senator Mark Warner, and we have a call this morning from David from Chesapeake. Good morning, David.
Thanks for taking my call. My question is for the senator. With all of this back and forth kind of stallmating in Washington and Congress, the GOP, and we'll just say the GOP, how is it that these congressmen, with the duties that they are charged with, how is it that they're able to be irresponsible like they are and not tackling these tough major issues and decisions and getting something done? How is it that they're able to do this and hold their party lines and not be asked or forced to resign? I mean, if anybody in a company was to do what they're doing as a job performance, they'd be fired. How is it that these guys are even keeping their jobs?
Thanks for your call, David.
And I'd like to know what your position is on that.
Well, David, I guess the straight answer is you get to decide whether they get fired or not. One of the things we all, it's almost a cottage industry to talk about, how did Congress get so broken and what's wrong? And, there's a variety of theories from everything from in the old days, Congress would, when they got elected to Washington, they'd move their families here and people would get to know each other. And then particularly when Speaker Gingrich took over, he said, no, don't come to Washington. Don't move your families. Go home every weekend. So a lot of these people didn't get to know each other. And, it's harder to call somebody and question somebody's patriotism and motives if you actually know their families and, know where they go to church, and and you've shared, you actually know somebody. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in the Senate, let folks get to know each other. Second thing is, and I think this really is particularly in the House more than the Senate, because the Senate, since we just have 2 senators from each state, by that virtue, senators have to be a little more broadly representative. But computerized redistricting, which draws these crazy lines so that districts become so one-sided. And again, both parties use this. It's not just the GOP. The Democrats do it as well when they're in control in a state. And you end up making the primary the most important part of the election. And that means the very few people on each side who vote in the primaries oftentimes then that's the important election, so you play to the extremes. One thing, and this has candidly not made me very popular sometimes with my own folks, but I would ask the listeners if I could make a blanket appeal for the country. I would say 2 things to any listener who wants to change this kind of gridlock we've got. One is, don't support any candidate who signs one of these silly pledges, whether the pledge is to never raise taxes or the pledge is never to touch Social Security. Anybody that comes with one of these blanket pledges, I don't think deserves to be in Congress, because then you're not going to have somebody that's going to be able to do what is necessary, because they're restricted before they even get there. And second, and this is even a little bit bolder, but if we need to reinforce people kind of being willing to, I believe, meet for some common ground. So, if you're a listener that's a Democrat, maybe one of the next elections, go find a Republican who's willing to do some more revenues and support him. If you're a Republican, go find a Democrat who's willing to do entitlement reforms and support him. We've got to reinforce the behavior that we ask for from our elected officials, which is finding that common ground. Too often we talk about it, but then we all go back to our own personal political foxholes.
The number is 866-611-NEWS. That's 866-611-6397. Good morning, Tony from Chesapeake.
Good morning, Senator Warner. I got a chance to shake your hand at the governor's ball when you were governor. Please throw your name into the political ring for a presidential or vice presidential election. You have my support. I believe you're an intelligent man, and I know you're a man of integrity. And I have a question for you about the mortgage crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that mortgage investors are still making millions, now billions, putting Americans out of their homes? There has to be a solution where homeowners can retain their homes and stop this slide into foreclosure.
Well, Tony, one, thank you for your comment. And two, you're right. If we look back to when the financial crisis took place, we did a whole lot of things to help reinforce the banking system. And I think, while it was terribly unpopular, I think it was the right thing to do, because if credit had frozen up worse, we would have been even in a worse place. What we didn't do a very good job of was with the homeowner relief. We had a series of programs. There was a HARP program and a HAMP program, and they've gotten a little bit better. But there's still an awful lot of folks who are a bit underwater. So what I've been willing to support was legislation that would say, let's go in, and particularly those mortgages that were held by Fannie and Freddie, the so-called government GSEs, and say, in addition to doing loan modification, in terms of the interest payment, why don't we also allow them to do some principal modification, write down a bit of the principal, so that if you can keep the homeowner in the home, that's better than the home going vacant for months on end, which decreases the value not only of that home, but the homes in the neighborhood. We've not been able to get that through. And the economy is recovering, and we may have missed part of that window. What I think we're going to have happen is, and you're right that now these mortgage companies, Fannie and Freddie, are starting to make more money, but I am working on a major reform in this area, again with a Republican colleague, that will revamp the so-called GSEs and, frankly, put more private capital involved in some of these organizations, so the taxpayer's not at risk, because we still are owed over $100 billion because we helped bail out these entities, and we're getting that money back, but we got to get it all back. And secondly, on a going forward basis, we also have to realize and this doesn't fully answer Tony's questions, I know, because I don't think we're going to do the principal reduction in a major way going forward. But one of the things we're going to also have to recognize is, consumers are going to have to be better educated and better informed in these kind of no-doc loans and these kind of loans that are too good to be true, subprime loans. I don't think they should come back. I remember my own sister getting into a house where it was above her means, and she said, well, look, it's, this low interest rate. I said, well, Lisa, in a couple of years, this is going to pop up. And, sure enough, it popped up, and, she had an Uncle Mark to help her out. Uncle Sam wasn't able to help out all of the other folks that needed it. But I think looking back on the financial crisis, failure to help more homeowners was probably our biggest single mistake.
Robert from Hampton, good morning to you. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Good morning, Senator Warner. I really appreciate this opportunity. I have talked to Tim Kaine, Senator Kaine, back when he was running for governor about framing, and I noticed you to talk a lot about common ground, and so does my congressman, J. Randy Forbes. And I, being a PhD in engineering, I have a lot of treatises and have written him some stuff about, please stop using common ground. It's a bad frame because the only thing it says is that you're all standing there looking at one another. While useful, doesn't get any work done. The word I want you to use is compromise. I want you to take your principles, set them aside, and do the work of the nation. And if it goes against your principles, swallow hard, and if it's good for the nation, do it. If it isn't, then don't do it. But, and there's a debate that can be had there, but the people who stand there, and Congressman Forbes is one of them, and I have talked to him numerous times about this, is that, no, I'm not going to compromise my principles, therefore this is a bad idea, and I'm not even going to talk about it. And it's like, really? 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 Do the work of the nation, please.
Amen.
All right, thank you.
Amen. And I guess I hear what you said. I know whether common ground, compromise, all these terms come somewhat loaded. Here, what I used to say was, what if you hired me coming to the Senate, try this one out. What I said I would be is a bipartisan radical centrist, because people also think, well, centrist doesn't sound like a good term, but I actually think centrist means you've got to think about each issue. If you're on either end of the spectrum, left or right, you don't really need to think that much because there's an ironclad ideological position on each side. If you're trying to be a centrist, sometimes that means you've got to be a real radical, which means you've got to take some of the best ideas from both ends of the spectrum. But thanks for your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Whit from Charlottesville, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Just a follow-up to what he just said. I think that's also a sign of a really good leader if you're going to use business metrics in government. A good leader always sets aside their personal objectives and looks more towards the subject matter experts and people who can contribute and makes decisions based on that. So I think I appreciate the previous comment. My question has more to do with education and the correlation between the health of an education system and the health of the business climate, because I don't know if there's an assumption that one will feed the other, that if we have a healthy economy, then education will benefit. But I know in Virginia, if we're a very healthy environment for business, that seems great. But when we moved to Virginia in 2003 and started a family and began to look at elementary schools and primary schools and middle schools, there's none in Virginia that are on the top 100. If it weren't for the high schools in Northern Virginia, there wouldn't be any schools from Virginia that are considered leadership schools by several different independent agencies. And then we have the same situation on a national level where our economy is, supposedly one of the strongest, and our university systems are very strong, but educationally, we're not even in the top 10 there either compared to other nations. So I'm curious your sense of, is the economy a separate animal and you got to have it and take care of it, but education is either inherently connected to it or not really connected to it? And if it isn't connected, how do we get people to start feeling like it really matters and that, great education isn't just for Denmark. Like, we deserve, we can do this. We can be the best education system in the world. How do you break that? How do you get people to actually care if we know it's actually valuable?
Well,
Thanks for your call.
Thanks for your call. I believe that education is an essential piece of the economy because, again, I go back to my earlier comment, America's value add in the world economy is not going to be cheap labor. It's going to be intellectual capital creation and a well-educated, well-trained workforce. I would respectfully, though, disagree with you that Virginia does not do well in education. Matter of fact, when I was governor, one of the other recognitions we got was that Education Week said that Virginia actually, for a lifetime of educational opportunity from preschool all the way through graduate school, so looking at our education system in total, offered a child the best opportunities of any state in the nation, number one. Number two, I would also argue that while I would like to see more public support for our colleges and universities, I would take our public higher education system and match it against any other state in the country. California used to be the best, but they allowed theirs to go downhill, and we have to guard against that in Virginia. But I think it is still quite strong. On our NAEP scores, which is the one kind of common measurement standard, which measures mostly at 4th grade and 8th grade, we actually do much better than average and much better than other states. Number 5, one of the things about our educational system when we look at comparisons to the rest of the world, and this is, again, I hate to kind of get in the weeds, but this is an important issue. It is true there are countries like Denmark and some of the Scandinavian Scandinavian countries that are very homogeneous, that are all very high income, that have higher scores. And we, particularly kind of teenage years, in some of our math scores start to fall behind. But many of these other nations, including a number of the Asian nations that seem to have higher scores, they actually don't graduate that many people out of high school. About what the level of 8th grade, they will take people out of the formal education path and put them on a trade path. And so their numbers compared high school graduates to high school graduates, to the Indias of the world and Chinas of the world and elsewhere, our percentage of the population who actually gets through high school is much higher. So there is a little bit of apples and oranges comparison. Last point I want to make on this is, and I say that I don't want to defend, simply sound like I'm a defender of the system. We need to break some more glass in education. I tried a series of things as governor where, for example, trying to particularly create an ability to get a free semester from college in high school for senior year. In senior year, to change that, revolutionize that. We've got to do a better job, particularly of getting girls and children of color to stay in math and science. We lose a lot of those kids in middle school years. They track completely fine, and then middle school years, girls and children of color leave. And when you look at the Virginia at this point, we're 30% children of color and 52% women. So, that is a bad economic deal if we don't have more math and science from those populations. And we also have to understand, and it will sound a little bit heresy, I think college is great, but four-year liberal arts college may not be the right choice for every student. And one of the things that I've been passionate about and tried to do a lot more as governor than I've been able to do here in the Senate is recognize that career and technical education is a valuable path for a lot of folks. You may not need that full college degree. You may just need a certification or an associate's degree. And a new piece of legislation I did put in just this past week with Marco Rubio from Florida is this. I call it Know Before You Go, and it basically says, for each degree or industry certification, 1, how long it's going to take you to finish; 2, what the percentage of students who will graduate, and 3, what's your chances of getting a job and what's that job going to pay. So as you are deciding where you want to go to school and what you want to do, particularly with the cost of higher education still skyrocketing, you ought to have that information, and we collect it, but we just don't make it easily usable for families as they decide. And this will be valuable, I think, not just for that, high school student going on to college, picking their college and picking their major, but particularly important for what's going to increasingly be the larger number of people in higher education who are people after high school coming back to a community college. They really need to know, if I get that associate's or that industry certification, am I going to get a job, and what's it going to pay? Sorry for the long answer.
Oh, no, not at all. We're talking with Senator Mark Warner. The number is 866-611-NEWS. About your long answer, we're about a minute from break, so I want you to consider this, and then we'll pick it up after the break. First of all, we've got a call from Robert from Halifax County, who has an interesting question about promoting jobs in Southside Virginia, and you have just become chairman of the Senate Commerce Subpanel that promotes trade, investment, innovation, and manufacturing to boost U.S. competitiveness. So we want to talk about that when we get back. Are you game?
Yes, I am. Absolutely.
I wish there were a pickup basketball game that could be seen or recorded in some way.
I'm pretty ugly basketball player, but yeah.
But you probably get the job done.
Well, I get the job, yeah, but it's not it. Nobody's going to ever say I was graceful.
So this note before we go into break, Virginia Conversations now has a Facebook page. Just like us there, and you'll get a weekly reminder of our guests and phone number. You can also join the discussion on the topic of the week. Also, past editions of Virginia Conversations can be heard at virginiapublicradio.org. We'll be back with Senator Mark Warner in just a moment. Welcome back. We're talking with Senator Mark Warner. He's taking your calls as well. The number is 866-611-NEWS. That's 866-611-6397. Senator, we're talking about the fact that you're the new chair of the Senate Commerce Subpanel, and we're talking about trade, investment, manufacturing. What will be the biggest challenge of the next year for you?
Well, I am still very focused on the debt and deficit. I'm very focused on housing finance reform. I've actually got some legislation working on end-of-life issues, which is a challenging topic. But on this new Commerce Subpanel, there's two things I want to look at. One is a component of that whole trade and job creation is tourism. For every 1% additional foreign tourism coming to the United States, that adds 128,000 jobs. And we have an international gateway airport at Dulles and how we can draw those tourists down to Southside and down to Southwest. I think about things like we did with the Crooked Road Music Heritage Trail and some of our other, to kind of get people off the 64-95 corridor is important. And also, and I think we may have that caller from Southside, a lot of challenges around the issue of trade, but the fact is 95% of all the new customers for American stuff are going to be foreign. And we do a really crummy job in the United States of being able to help small and mid-sized businesses figure out how to sell their goods and products abroad. And one of the things I'm looking at is how we can kind of rationalize some of those various trade support services that are in about 8 different agencies inside the federal government.
Robert from Halifax, good morning to you.
Yes.
Understand you have an interest in job creation in Southside.
Hello?
Yes. Can you hear us okay? Hello? Good morning. Can you hear us, Robert? No. Okay. But just to summarize what he told our producer, we've seen the devastation of Southside. We've seen textiles take a hit. We've seen how trade in the reverse direction has impacted, particularly Southside Virginia, but other sectors. And I suppose that gets to the heart of his comment or question. Do you want to address?
Yeah, let me try to address it. I mean, clearly, we've seen job losses as textiles, particular furniture, left the region. I think some of that, these were textile plants that used to be in New England in the 50s and 60s, and then they came to Southside and North Carolina in the 60s and 70s. And, then they went to Mexico for about 10 years, and then they went to China for about 15 years. And clearly on trade, we've got to have a level playing field so that these countries that don't respect environmental laws or fair labor laws and others, we need to be equal. I remember, though, when I was governor, bringing back an Indian company called Essel Propack, who's now expanded 4 times in Danville, that's got hundreds and hundreds of people that does polymers. And, didn't change everybody's mind about trade in Danville, but it showed that there was a reverse benefit that is taking place as we try to attract foreign-based businesses into America. Also, as the wage rates in China have gone up, America actually is becoming more competitive for insourcing of jobs. And with the explosion of energy opportunities, particularly in natural gas, we become a much more competitive spot for manufacturing in America, and we need to do more to push that manufacturing back here. So there are things we can do in terms of changing parts of the tax code that actually promote companies moving jobs offshore and give them actually a little more tax benefit moving jobs onshore. I also recall, my proudest day as governor was when I was down in Russell County in Lebanon, Virginia, when we were able to bring about 700 high-quality information technology jobs from CGI and Northrop Grumman down to Lebanon. That, to my mind, was the best example of, in the internet-driven world, you can build a company and place a company anywhere, and those jobs have helped really revitalize that community. But to get those jobs there, and this goes back into the earlier question, one, you've got to have a well-educated workforce. And two, and this kind of goes into the question of 21st century infrastructure, you got to have broadband. So, we made major investments while I was governor in broadband technology. And again, one of the reasons why, not to go again full circle for our listeners back to the debt and deficit, if we continue on this stupid sequestration path that is going to cut domestic investment from 16% of our revenues down to about 4%, you're not going to see any further public sector investment in research and development and infrastructure from roads, bridges to broadband, and that is going to put the South Sides and the Southwest Virginias further behind. And last point, again, to reinforce a point I made earlier, is, if you're in Northern Virginia and you want to start a new company, there are venture capital firms, there are other areas to go find the money to get started. If you're in Danville, or if you're in Martinsville, or if you're in Ferrum, or if you're in, Wise, it's harder. So that's one of the reasons why I do think this idea about crowdfunding and crowdsourcing, and the final regulations are not out, that would allow you to post on one of these internet sites like Kickstarter or Indiegogo or others, or some of the ones that are kind of already starting. Here's my idea. If you want to invest, it's a way to reach local investors beyond your personal network. And, we don't know if it's fully going to work, but it might be a tool, particularly for rural communities, to have some of those entrepreneurs, bright young people that come out of Southside, not feel like they've got to pick up and move to Northern Virginia or Richmond or elsewhere to get their business started. In a interconnected world, you shouldn't have to leave your hometown to find a world-class job, and we've still not made that a reality.
This is another issue for which you're in the news. You've added your name to the growing list of Democrats who support marriage equality. Polls are showing that a majority of Americans support marriage equality. And before we get your input on that, I want to read these two quotes from two different sides of the aisle.
Sure.
Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill had long held off supporting marriage equality. Her quote says that her views on this subject have changed over time. But as many of my gay and lesbian friends, colleagues, and staff embrace long-term committed relationships, I find myself unable to look them in the eye without honestly confronting this uncomfortable inequality. And here's a quote from Georgia Senator Saxby Chambliss. He's part of your Gang of Six. When asked if his views had changed on gay marriage, the Georgia Republican said, "I'm not gay, so I'm not going to marry one." So let's look to your views and to what happened with you to add your name to that list of Democratic supporters.
Well, let me back up to when I was again governor. I was proud, but probably late. I was the first governor to say that in our state workforce we weren't going to discriminate based on sexual orientation, and that was late 2005, early 2006, and that was viewed as relatively progressive at that point. And, I was concerned there was going to be a lot of blowback. Candidly, there was virtually none. And I had moved to civil unions, and then in terms of marriage equality, it just was time. And, I'd always felt some level of uncomfortable. I'd obviously campaigned against some of the anti-gay legislation that Virginia had put in place. What kind of helped move me was, again, friends and others, but also it was my three daughters who were like, Dad, their question was kind of like, what century are you living in? And, and it is the time and it's right. And candidly, this is one of those issues where the public is way ahead of the politicians. And, it is, I think we've seen, for example, all of this debate about within the military has changed. I've heard virtually no consternation after the fact. I think the public's ahead of this. I remember after I made my announcement about coming out in support of marriage equality, I was traveling through the Valley in some very conservative communities. And, and I expected to get some feedback, but it was, again, refreshing to me about, I think, the kind of good hearts of most Virginians and Americans, the number of people who would kind of come up to me, and they weren't all that public, but would come up to me and say, Senator, thanks for your statement about marriage equality. So I'm proud of where I'm at, and I hope the Supreme Court acts, and I think this is going to be an issue where, 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, why did it take so long?
Richard from Virginia Beach, good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning. You were talking about education a few minutes ago, and my
Sure.
wife is a math teacher in Virginia Beach. She has 29 years in the system, and this is the first year that she is now earning more than a first-year grad from Virginia Tech with a BSc in math. And that seems to be a very big disconnect, not just in Virginia, but around the country. There seems to be a lack of value for educators. And I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, the level that she goes above and beyond. I told Virginia Beach City Council a couple of years ago when I went down and spoke to them that they steal my wife because she puts in far more than 8 hours a day.
Well, Richard, I agree. And, one of the things I used to be before I was governor, I was chair of the Math Science Coalition in Virginia. And, the remarkable thing was that literally half of our middle school math and science teachers weren't trained in math and science. Because if you got that math and science education, you can make a heck of a lot more money elsewhere. So again, I think, I support additional funding for teachers, but I also think we need to even be thinking a little more radically. One of the things that that education advocates, and I count myself as one of them, as May Lilly mentioned, we made the largest single investment in public education in Virginia history when I was governor. But what sometimes people don't acknowledge is that, teachers work on a different kind of school year and contract. They do have a couple of months off. They have a 10-month contract for teaching. I think what we ought to do is maybe we ought to start a dual track in terms of teaching. If you want to be a traditional teacher and teach 10 months, we're going to try to get you a little more money, but you're going to probably still have a salary that's going to be lower than what you could get in an equivalent job. And then maybe there ought to be a path that's a full 12-month teacher path where you get 2 weeks off a year, but in that contract you're going to be paid considerably more, but you're going to teach summer school, you're going to do other things, and you're going to work a job like other professional jobs are, where you work 49, 50 weeks out of the year rather than having the kind of 2 months off. And so a complete restructuring of what it means to be the teaching profession, because somehow we do have to elevate teaching into the equivalent, high professional status that it deserves. But we do also, I think, in all fairness, need to acknowledge that our current teacher track has a different kind of time structure than other jobs do. So I'm open for all these things, and I go back again to that number, what I'm most concerned about, and I say this as 3 daughters who kind of lost their interest in math, and none of them in math and science, I have to tell you, who lost a lot of their interest about middle school years. We got to solve this, and our number of children of color who drop out of math and science and in STEM fields in those middle school years is a real crisis.
I'd like to try to get a couple of more calls in. We'll see if we can go for the abridged version, but let's start with
Okay.
John. John from Crozet. Good morning.
It's good to talk to you folks.
Thanks, John.
I wonder if I could get the Senator's comments on the so-called Internet sales tax, which as currently proposed seems to me to be quite confusing. Would it not be a better idea to impose a tax nationally and then split them up among all the states in the same ratio as sales in one state bears to all the states. Your comment, sir.
Well, John, I understand, but because the sales tax varies so much based upon states, because some states that don't have income tax have high sales tax, and you've got certain states that don't have a sales tax at all, I think that would be challenging to do. And we would be accused of moving towards a VAT tax, which a value-added tax, which actually every other industrial country in the world has, by the way. I do think there are ways, and I used to be in the cell phone industry, and when it first started, and you had all these different systems, and you went from one system to another, you had roaming charges. We had a clearinghouse that sorted all this out. I do support this internet sales tax because it's basically saying is, why should we give an extra advantage to an internet-based retailer as opposed to the bricks and mortar person who, where you got people coming into the bricks and mortar store and then go buying it online to save sales tax. That's not fair. Virginia loses a couple $100 million a year from that. But I do think there's ability to have a single point of kind of clearing so that the online retailer doesn't have to deal with 50 different jurisdictions and the accounting concerns. I think there is both a software package and a clearing package that could alleviate the confusion. But appreciate your question.
And hopefully we'll get just enough time for this one. Good morning, Sarah from Chilhowie.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question. Senator Warner, I've tried to contact you several times in the past couple months regarding two issues, the Keystone Pipeline, but also fracking in the George Washington Jefferson National Forest. And I have yet to hear a response from you, although I've heard back from Senator Kaine. And I was curious about your position on natural gas exploration and fracking in the National Forest in Virginia.
Okay, well, first of all, Sarah, I'm very disappointed. If you will contact warner.senate.gov and send me something today, we are. I pride myself on making sure, even if you don't like my answer, that everybody gets an answer.
Right.
So let me go through.
Actually, I just want to say real quickly about that, too. I'm actually surprised to hear that, too, because when we were part of the press corps covering you as governor, you were one of the most accessible governors I've seen. So I'm sorry, Sarah, that you did have that.
I actually went to your office in Abingdon and talked to your staff as well and still didn't hear a response. So.
Well,
if
Sarah offline could give us a contact place, you're going to hear absolutely. In terms of fracking in the National Forest, that raises some real concern to me. I think there's still a lot. Clearly, fracking has allowed enormous opportunities for natural gas. We are soon going to become an actual exporter of energy as opposed to an importer. I've been following what the EPA is doing and others, that it appears, at least so far, that that fracking technology, which has been around since the 1940s, seems to have been done fairly safely. But I am a little concerned that it almost seems to be too good to be true at this point, as we see it in Pennsylvania and North Dakota, for example, are areas that have been explosive in this. But before we get into the national forests, I want to make sure that we kind of have all the science done. So I think you're going to continue to see fracking done on the private sector areas. But I have some concerns. I know there are some additional studies being done right now, and I'd want to wait to see the results of those studies first before we expand, particularly into the George Washington National Forest. But I appreciate the question. I do hope Sarah will get us a contact point offline, because I'll give her a much fuller explanation if she'd like.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of Virginia Conversations. I want to thank our guest, Senator Mark Warner. And I want to tell you, thanks to George Washington University, we have photographic evidence of the senator's form on the basketball court. See for yourself on the new Virginia Conversations Facebook page. That's our edition. Are you excited to see what this is?
Lily, I don't know. I don't know whether this is this kind of like...
There's no stopping it.
This
it's
is
in
not
motion.
called a press extortion, is it, or something like that? Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the great questions.
Conversations. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.